Yes.
Yeah, you're audible. You're visible as well.
Yeah.
Are you well?
Yeah, I'm quite well.
Good work.
Thank you.
Acha, I just turned on because Azan is going on in the background, huh? So I'm turning off again. I just wanted to say that. I mean, you'll be able to hear it actually.
Welcome to the plenary session. The chair of this session is Professor Suchorita Chattopadhyay, Professor of Comparative Literature at Jadavpur University. She's also the founder and coordinator of the Center for Canadian Studies, Jadavpur University, a member of the Indian Members Council, Shastri Indo-Canadian Institute. She has served on the executive committee of the institute and has served as the president from 2016 to 17. Professor Chattopadhyay has been the principal investigator of the UKRE project on comparing comparative literatures. She is the co-PI for the ongoing SPART project on academic social responsibility and the humanities in India. She has also coordinated projects under RUSA 2. She is an executive committee member of the Comparative Literature Association of India. Her areas of interest are Canadian literature and culture, European literature, South Asian literature, and translation studies. Over to you, Professor Chattopadhyay.
Thank you, Kunal. Welcome to the plenary session 1. The speakers are Ipshita Chanda. Ipshita Chanda has taught comparative literature since 1993 at Jadavpur University, Kolkata until 2017, and since then at the English and Foreign Languages University, Hyderabad. The second speaker would be Anirban Mondal. Anirban Mondal is a doctoral candidate at the Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Kolkata. He is interested in topics related to social and cultural histories, language and translation studies, pedagogy of history and politics of textbook writing, etc. Anirban Mondal has obtained his BA honors and MA degrees in history from Presidency College and Jadavpur University, respectively. He has translated books and essays by Romila Thapar, Dipesh Chakraborty, and others. He also edited a translation of Ishita Banerjee and a compilation on archival materials. The third speaker in this session is Sachin Ketkar. Sachin C. Ketkar is a bilingual writer, translator, and academician. His most recent book is Venkatesh Madgolkar, A Village Full of Stories and a Forest Full of Tales, writer in context, published by Routledge India 2023, co-edited with Kirti Ramachandra. His poetry collections are Skin, Spam, and Other Fake Encounters, selected Marathi poems in translation, Jora Shandatya ब्लॉगवरचे काही अंश 2010, विंतीस वैच्या खिडकीतून दोकावताना 2004, and A Dirge for the Dead Dog and Other Incantations 2003. He has translated and edited an anthology of contemporary Marathi poetry titled Live Update, an anthology of recent Marathi poetry in 2005. He won the Indian Literature Poetry Translation Prize for translation of Gujarati poetry in 2000, given by Indian Literature Journal, Sahitya Academy, and Lokanete Rajaram Bapu Patil Maharashtra Lalit Kala Academy, Islampur, for contribution to translation. His books on criticism are Changlia Kavite Varshi, Statutory Warning, Samkalin Marathi Kavita, Jagatiki Ani Bhashantar 2016, and Trans Migrating Words, Refractions on Indian Translation Studies 2010. He works as professor in English, Faculty of Arts, The Maharaja Sayaji Rao University of Vadodara, Gujarat. His forthcoming books are A Critical History of Marathi Literature and Dilip Chitre, Makers of Indian Literature. So we start with Ipshita Chanda.
Yeah. Good afternoon. And to start with, thank you, Suchorita, and the organizers, Bharti ma'am and Ramesh ma'am. Thank you very much for coming. And since I said that, I will start with a story, as all of us have been doing. This is at least contentious, I think, and the most, hopefully the most educative way to start, because we have a lot to learn from Chandra Mohanji. So I'll start with two stories. I mean, they're not stories, they're actually part of the life of comparative literature in India, and definitely the life of the Comparative Literature Association of India. So many of us have talked about, we have a personal relationship. And following the cardinal example of Professor Harish Trivedi, I am going to divide my talk into, I don't know how many parts it will be, but it will be in parts, and I will try to connect the parts. That is trajectories, comparative literature, translation. I'm taking it all together, actually. So there cannot be any specific parts as such. So I remember this was in Jaipur, and many of us here were present there. And one of the conversations that we had was, "Ye log alag kyun baithte hain?" I will not elaborate on this. I'll connect it to a conversation I had with Professor Ramyodip, who said to me once that if you want to do Indian literature, you must love Indian people. I don't think I'll need to connect this for anyone present here. Chandra Mohanji taught us that connecting with Indian people could be a full-time job, a profession. The reason for why we are here today and the reason for why comparative literature in India is what it is and cannot be had it not been for that reason, could not have been. There are many people here who can connect this, not with our individual relationships with Chandra Mohanji, but with our individual relationships with each other, facilitated, nurtured and fostered by Chandra Mohanji, where each of us had to metaphorically translate our perspectives, our beings, our cultures, such that it was possible to communicate with other beings, other cultures. Jansi has called it a philosophy. And Jansi has been one of the persons who has popularized both the academic and the organizational structure of comparative literature from the time that she was, well, I don't know whether it is chosen or appointed or whatever it is, Vice Chancellor of one of the 9 universities, central universities that were set up in 2008 and 9. And Jansi was also parallelly at that time the president of CLAI from 2007. And that is how, and I had the great pleasure of being present with both of them when they had this conversation about proposing that comparative literature should be a subject which Jansi actually managed to start in her department. And then this legend was passed from mouth to mouth as the institutional history of comparative literature, facilitated by, always it was X, Y, Z, and Professor Chandra. So translation actually, and I was, talking about the pedagogy of comparative literature. Actually, we've been talking just now about the institutional structure of comparative literature in India specifically, which is relational. It is a philosophy of life, as Jansi and Topudidi and Professor Trivedi have so eloquently pointed out. And one of the things that Professor Trivedi did underline was that things have changed. Think about it. I've never known him to be this mild when he has to point out that you're going down the wrong path. Things have changed. Think about it. Translation can be used, studied, quote unquote, researched, quote unquote, by monolingual people. That seems like a blasphemy. It is a contradiction of the word translation itself. And this is not to advocate, as my teacher, Professor Manubendra Bandyopadhyay, he did not advocate. He actually did a certain thing, about which I will come to in a moment, because that is not a trajectory we have followed. And it is a milestone that we have bypassed. And for that, the system is to, well, our relation with the system is to blame, because we are in fact non-systemic. I mean, Professor Trivedi was talking about a bad comparison, and so I wrote to him, what is a bad comparison? Who are you to judge what is bad? So what kind of ethics are we talking about? What kind of relations are we talking about? That is the fundamental thing about translation. And there I will just fit in the other story from Chandra Mohanji's, I mean, I'll say that my travels with Chandra Mohanji, you know, like Graham Greene had that book about my travels with my aunt, so well, travels with my friend, Professor Chandra Mohan, in Kunming, where Chandra Mohanji was the only person who knew what was a very famous cosmetic, which was produced only in Kunming, which was required by all the women who he knew back home, who had told him, bring this back for us. And then he forced me. And I mean, people have said he called me this and he called me that. I will not say what he called me because it is very embarrassing. I just try to live up to what he called me. So I'll just not go further than that. But Chandra Mohanji he forced me. He said, ki, bhaiya, aap bhi le lo na, ek chota sa le lene se kya hota hai? It was pearl cream, which was specific to the culture and the, you know, the economy of Kunming, which is completely different from Beijing, etc., etc. These are the things that we learned about comparative literature practice traveling with him. And one of the things that he taught us about the ethics of comparative literature, about the ethics of relation, of the ethics of relating to difference, of not absolutizing the other and putting the other in a category and wondering whether the other is, you know, Dalit, half, black, 3/4, marginal, how much. All this, excuse my saying so, nonsense takes a far, far back seat. This is another thing which Professor Trivedi pointed out, again, surprisingly in a very bland manner, but he was taking us to task for bringing one theory, two texts, and a concluding line. So if that is where translation has taken comparative literature, I think it is time to stop. Because I have also heard eloquent defenses of how translation teaches me something. It makes me aware of something. Well, in that case, it still remains me-centric. It does not take the other into consideration. And if I pretend to be monolingual, I mean, I'm saying pretend because in India it is impossible to be monolingual. And as long as it is that, we remain what we are. I don't know why we are so wary of saying the word plural. We keep saying multi this and that and the other, and cross this and that and the other. But there are so many heritages that live within our own relationships, our own languages, and therefore our own cultures. So what prevents us? What are we scared of? It's just because the West does not say. And this is another thing that I have had a long, long, long struggle with Professor Chandra Mohan about the term foreigner. And those conversations were about relating to difference, about hierarchies of difference. And that is what has been reflected in the way in which he regulated the institutional structure of CLAI. And this did not reflect in the disciplinary structure in at least 80% of the departments we have here. But Professor Chandra Mohan was instrumental in creating, in catalyzing, in fact, innumerable syllabi across the country at different points in the last 20 years. And even there, this conversation about what is the role of translation. Are we treating translation? I mean, people say with a great deal of aplomb, it's a process, not a product. It's not even an object. And do you understand what you mean when you say that it is a process? It is a process of learning to hear the other. It is a process of humility. That was the question when he asked that ye log झुंड बना के क्यों रहते हैं? Why do they stick to each other like this? And a similar thing is what I learned from Professor Romila. Distribute yourself, he used to say. So if we pretend that translation, by translating language A into language B, we are going to do a great deal of responsible work, certainly our intentions are right. There is nothing wrong with that. But what change does it bring to our conception of the discipline? Because translation is not an object. It is not a process. It is a way of life which we are doing every moment. And in that context, in the plural context in which we live, we cannot live without translation. So in that context, that's where I would like to place my teacher, Professor Monolingualism Mondal, who throughout his life translated the world to Bangla and did not seek world recognition for himself by writing in English. Manu Babu's few works that have been translated, his theoretical works, because each of his translations of world literature and Indian literature into Bangla created the mentality of cross-cultural contact. It contextualized cross-cultural contact. So people ask thousands of questions. Does he know all of these languages? He created the situation in which he could open himself to those languages and cultures and then locate them within his context, which he chose. And all of these theoretical writings are in Bangla. And we, his students, to our shame, I think, read Derrida. We read Gayatri Spivak in English. Gayatri Spivak does not write in Bangla. But having read both of them, I can, from my perspective, which I claim is a comparative perspective, because that is all I have done for 30 years now, more than 30 years. So Manu Babu did not seek international fame, but he brought international literature to the Indian context in an Indian language. And that is not a milestone that we have. I mean, all of us can say with great deal of pride, we write in English, we write in Bangla. Manu Babu staked his reputation on the language that he chose, and that was a political choice. That was a choice that an ideal comparatist would make. We are not called upon to be ideal comparatists because we teach, and we teach in a situation in which it is very important to understand how one semiotic system brought by one language otherizes. That is the fundamental burden of comparative literature, to understand otherness, to be open to difference. That to be open does not mean to accept difference which is violent, just because it is institutionalized. So until and unless we understand where we are, what our perspective is it possible for us to translate at all? Until and unless we understand what a cross-cultural understanding, I won't even say that, I will just say engagement with the other. It is, literature engages us with the uniqueness of the other. We can't seek to silence it with our words. How much Vikram Sheth understands of Jai Hanuman is not directly related to what his idea of the English language is. It is indirectly related. Victory to Hanuman would have been an obvious translation instead of saying hail. But where does hail come from? Which language of devotion or which language of heroism does hail come from? We only hear Jai. So if he cannot hear Jai in English, then how can he claim to be a translator? And if comparative literature cannot point out this to him, then it's a failed practice. If we follow the trajectory of, all of this foreignization and domestication is old hat. Now we come to something which Professor Trivedi is also complicit in, post-colonial translation and gender and translation and X and translation and Y and translation. And in fact, very pertinently, a colleague asked a comparative literature interviewee that even we do these things in English. So how are you different? And that is the question which has been at the basis of the practice of comparative literature for the last 35 years. And if today we still cannot answer that question, then perhaps we should go back and look at our missed milestones. Professor Chandra Mohan, I was at the receiving end of this when I coordinated the 2007 CLAI conference in Calcutta, where many of you were present and many others were present also, who are not here today, including, of course, Jan Mohanji. So at the end of, session planning and structure and all of that, he said, मेरे लिए एक जगह रखना, नहीं तो लोग बोलेंगे कि चंद्रमोहन तो सिर्फ दरी उठाते आता है. Thank you. There's something wrong at your end. I think you should, because we can't hear you at all. And that happened at the level. You're coming and going, and at other times you're echoing. That happened at the end of the previous session as well. You just faded out and,
Now, okay. Thank you, Ipshita. I'd now request Anirban to begin his talk.
Yes, thank you very much, Ipshita. And well, you don't understand me, but I liked very much your intervention, your lecture, and I'm happy to see you again. See you soon again.
Yeah, sure. We will. You please stay for Anirban as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good afternoon. Am I audible enough?
Yes,
Okay.
you are audible.
Thank you. First of all, I like to express my gratitude to the organizers of this conference, and particularly to my teacher Kunal Chattopadhyay for asking me to participate in the session. Now, basically, I am an outsider because as a student of history, I think I do not claim that I have much to say about translation studies or comparative literature. But as a student of history also, I have been fascinated with translation, as it is the way through which one could have a grasp over the past. And in that sense, all the histories of mankind comes to us through translations. Now, my presentation is going to deal with two aspects. Primarily, I will discuss how did the issue of translation as a strategy of communication in a monolingual environment develop since the inception of colonial system in India, particularly in Bengal. And eventually, I will share my personal experience as a translator of non-fiction, particularly academic writings, from English to Bengali. Now, talking about translation is the destiny of a previously colonial society. And the development of modern Bengalihood under the climate of colonialism faced the reality of translating ideas and texts between the vernacular and the language of the ruler. Hence, the 19th century intellectuals of Bengal were always thoughtful of the politics, possibilities, and also hindrances of translating texts. The colonial educational system was constantly served environment conducive to translation. And if we take a look at the history of the development of the modern Bengali prose, then it is evident that translating of non-fiction did serve an important purpose in its early development. And those projects of translation were not only limited to the language of the Raj, but from Sanskrit and Persian to Bengali also. And we should keep in mind that the Grammar of Bengal Language by Nathaniel Brassey Hallett translated a set of technical terms associated with colonial governance into Bengali. William Carey and his associates of Srirampur Mission Press started developing textbooks for students, and that project had been a landmark of translating texts into Bengali. And in 1801, Carey himself wrote a book titled Kathopokathon or Dialogues to introduce foreign civilians with the local vernacular as well as Bengali lifestyle and oral cultures. And the title page of that book clearly stated that these dialogues intended to facilitate the acquiring of the Bengali language. The Pandits and Munshis associated with the Fort William College were engaged in translating texts for the students. Therefore, we could argue that the edifice of our modernity constructed on the base of translation. Now, Raja Ram Mohan Rai, in his mission of reforming Hindu society, deployed the modern Bengali prose to counter his critics. And there he needed to translate Sanskrit texts into Bengali to substantiate his arguments. In 1822, Gaur Mohan Vidyalankar wrote Sri Shikha Vidhayak. The concept of reforming women's condition was in need of new terminologies. The young Bengals were in a constant search of translating their ideas between Bengali and English in a meaningful manner. So the reality of colonialism actually gave currency to a throbbing culture of translation. And people like Akhoy Kumar Datto developed words and terms synchronized with the colonial railway system. They knew too well that in a transitioning society, translating concepts and ideas are of optimum importance. Akhoy Kumar's good friend Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar did try his hands in translating texts from Sanskrit as well from English into Bengali, and his success rate was praiseworthy. In 1848, he translated few chapters of Marshman's History of Bengal as Bangalar Itihas, and his critics lambasted him as merely a translator devoid of any creative literary originality. Though at the same time, they acknowledged that in those dark days of Bengali language, translation was the most important tool through which one could uplift the vernacular. And Vidyasagar's non-fiction translation also included short biographical sketches of individuals like Copernicus, Galileo, Newton, etc. Introducing European physics and other modern disciplines into Bengali was not an easy task. And therefore, he needed to use unfamiliar Sanskrit terms in absence of appropriate Bengali ones. And sometimes he had to invent new terminologies. But Vidyasagar, being a pragmatic translator, was always considered the necessity of doing a proper, meaningful translation. And his famous book, Bodhodaya, is also a translation of Chambers' Rudiments of Knowledge. Now, in an influential study seeking translation, history, post-structuralism, and the colonial context, Tejoshini Niranjana demonstrates the other side of translation project, where the colonial masters constantly translated the colonized by collecting data about the local populations, and that facilitated communication between imperial rulers and their subjects. And Niranjana argues that translation involved much more than textual operations. She sees colonialism itself as a translation project whose aim is to transform its subject into familiar objects for the colonizer. And in this context, the entire body of Orientalism falls under the realm of translation, as it thus is the introduction of a textualized India to Europe, hence to domesticate the Orient and thereby turn it into a province of European learning. Now, learned people in the 19th century Bengal were often accustomed of knowing multiple languages, even different dialects and stylistics of the same language. Hence, using different writing styles for different literary genres was not alien to them. On the one hand, they wrote intellectually dense essays full of jargon and terminologies. On the other hand, the same author composed texts in a colloquial parlance. And they were well aware of the fact that a diverse set of words needed to be invented in order to communicate with the changing landscape of colonial modernity. And that attracted their attention towards translation of non-fiction. Because translating non-fiction, particularly academic texts, were an important project associated with the nationalization of education. Therefore, people were in search of new terminologies through which the reader could have a grasp of the conceptual framework of modern academic practices developed in the West. Actually, translation is the only aid through which one could communicate with the linguistic other, and it has been a modus operandi of colonial elite to hegemonize their position of cultural, political, and intellectual superiority. Now, I will focus on the issue of developing new terminologies for translating non-fiction, particularly academic texts. In 1877, Rajendra Mitra used different Bengali terminologies in a scheme for rendering of European scientific terms into the vernaculars of India. And since its inception, Bangio Sahitya Parishad has been invested in constructing technical terms for academic disciplines. Of course, creating new terminologies for the sake of doing so is going to be a futile task. So the translator not only needs to be pragmatic, but at the same time, she or he has to be aware of making the translation readable. If the reader of a translated text needs to consult the original one to get the meaning, then the translation is meaningless. In 1894, Ramendra Sundar Trivedi pointed out that the language of science is entirely different than the common practice of orality. So he prescribed that one needs to use a particular word for a particular meaning only. Using the same word for a second meaning will create confusion, and for Trivedi, it is the singular most important principle of developing terminologies for scientific disciplines. 1 year later, in 1895, another member of Sahitya Parishad claimed that thorough knowledge in Sanskrit as well as in the subject is needed to be a good translator. But Ramendra Sundar suggested that transliteration of the English term into Bengali is a better option than translating that term into Bengali. And Jogesh Chandra Rai Vidyanidhi also supported Trivedi's opinion. In 1896, Ramendra Sundar once again questioned the utility of using Sanskrit in developing terminologies. He had a clear conception of the task, that the need of the hour is to use the English terminologies without any change. In 1907, the Sahitya Parishad constituted groups of learned men to develop different sets of terminologies related to multiple branches of scientific studies. And other contemporary magazines were constantly working on devising new jargons. In 1936, the University of Calcutta published pamphlets on terminologies. But the central question is, how far these terminologies help to shape an academic culture of translating non-fictions into Bengali? Here we must discuss opinions of Mahamohopadhyay, Horoprasad Shastri, and Rajshekhar Basu. In a reflective essay, Nuton Kotha Gora, Creating New Jargons, Horoprasad Shastri elaborately discussed the problems associated with inventing new terminology for academic writings. He started the essay by acknowledging the fact that expressing alien concepts and facts in Bengali is not an easy, as there is a dearth of appropriate words and terminologies. And therefore, Shastri discussed the issue in great detail and showed how any rigidity on behalf of the translator could spoil the communicability of a text. He used an example of the word competition. Now, what could be the exact Bengali substitution of the word? And eventually, he showed that by using the English word competition, we could communicate the appropriate meaning in a better way to a Bengali reader rather than substituting with a Sanskrit one like Sangharsha. And therefore, he argued that the translator needs to be thorough in his or her understanding before using a new terminology. Rather than creating a new word altogether, Shastri suggested that one should look into different regional languages and then into Sanskrit for an appropriate alternative of the original European terminology. He went on explaining how a few popular Bengali terminologies are not only devoid of any meaning, but also caters an absolutely wrong concept. And he showed how the word observatory, once translated as Porjobekhonika, nobody knew its meaning, but the translated terminology gained currency through multiple usages. But there are more appropriate and popular terms common in other languages, like Man Mandir in Hindi. But the translator is not keen to search into other linguistic offerings. Rather than he or she is more fixated on creating a new one. Therefore, Horoprasad argued for a more pragmatic and commonsensical approach of the translator. He criticized the linguistic chauvinism of Bengali Hindu elites. They are too willing to borrow from Sanskrit rather than using common Persian or Arabic or Hindi or Oriya words. For Shastri, the core of the problem is the thought process of the translator that internally operates in English and is trying to express it in the vernacular. So in a way, he argued in favor of a flexibility of mind that the translator should inculcate. In 1340 Bengali era, Rajshekhar Basu, the famous lexicographer, wrote an essay on Bengali terminology. And there he said that terminologies are important for academic disciplines, but the commoners also are in need of new terminologies to communicate their new experiences. Hence, before inventing new terminologies, the specialist should be mindful of the public. Moreover, without creating appropriate Bengali terminologies, the process of disseminating education in vernacular is designed to be doomed. Therefore, Bosu suggested careful deliberation before using new technical terminologies, particularly in the realm of sciences. If one replaced oxygen by omlojan, then barring the translator, nobody could fathom the meaning of the word. And finally, Rajshekhar opined that creating new terminologies is a collective endeavor and everyone should stick to it. Simultaneously, if one excludes internationally accepted nomenclatures and terminologies, then it would be a naivety. So, drawing upon these issues as discussed above, I am now sharing my observations as translator of academic nonfiction. I have read the two essays by Horoprasad Sastry and Rajshekhar Bosu in my school days. But back then, obviously, I didn't have much idea of how translation could be used as a tool of effective communication. When I started translating academic texts, I was mindful of the suggestions made by Shastri and Bosu. While translating Romila Thapar's magisterial survey of early India, I told myself that I will not use a single new terminology until it is absolutely necessary. Rather, I did search multiple texts, old and new, for an appropriate Bengali substitution of the original English word. Now, consider the word stucco. In ancient India, different architectural styles used the medium of stucco. Now, originally, it is an Italian word of Germanic origin. So, as a translator, I have two options. Either I could keep the term as it is or find a proper Bengali alternative which sounds familiar. As the practice of stucco has been prevalent in India, then it must have few vernacular nomenclatures. And then I found a Bengali word for it, ponkho. And it has been a common word in Bengali even decades ago. Again, when I translated words like kin and clan, I thought that if kin is Gati, then what could the clan be? Suddenly, a word always used pejoratively by my mother reminds me that it could be appropriate for clan, Gati Gushti, Gati Goshti. Clan is actually a group that is based on kinship ties, so one needs to mention kin or Gati in conjunction of the Bengali word Goshti to render it a proper meaning. Else the reader could be confused by the word Goshti as it denotes variety of meanings in Bengali. Again, I did remind myself the dictum of Shastri that that is, don't use anything new if the old ones are useful. Same goes for the word Deccan. All the modern day textbooks now translate it as Dakshinatto, whereas Rajshekhar Bosu in his Chalantika categorically stated that Dakshinatto means related to the south. Rather, a few decades ago, people used the term Dakshinapot for Deccan, and that is an appropriate as well as historically accurate term. So I have used Dakshinapot instead of Dakshinatto for Deccan. Now, if other translators do not follow the same logic, then the anomaly will not be resolved. So there should be a way through which translators of different disciplines could arrive at a consensus regarding a terminology, and one must admit that the ethics and intellectual integrity of the translator is of optimum importance. Secondly, Romila Thapar used long quotations from different Sanskrit texts, epigraphs, and other sources, but those were English translations of the originals. So I employed a new strategy to translate those quotations. And I presume that strategy is a rarity, but is highly useful in my opinion. I have meticulously searched for authoritative Bengali translations of those same texts. For example, I used Ramesh Chandra Datta's Bengali translation of Rigved with proper acknowledgement and notes. Similarly, I used D.C. Sarkar's translation of Ashokan inscription. Even I made full use of two compilations by Professor Debarchana Sarkar of Jadavpur University on the post-Mauryan inscriptions. I could use my own translations of those texts, but as Romila Thapar herself used English translations of the originals, so translating those English texts into Bengali again would not hold any value. Instead, using an authentic source with proper notes and acknowledgement would render more historical as well as ethical value to the translation. But translating Dipesh Chakraborty and Ranajit Dasgupta has been a different ballgame. Dipesh Chakraborty is a regular columnist for few leading Bengali dailies, and his Bengali essays published regularly. And those are easily accessible to the readers. So there is a possibility that the reader of my translation is already accustomed with Chakraborty's Bengali prose, and its stylistics. So as a translator, I thoroughly studied his style of writing in Bengali, just like a method actor indeed, particularly his two essays on Azaz Ahmed's In Theory, published in Vishwabharati Noboporjay, and tried to replicate that writing style of Chakraborty. But for Ranajit Das Gupta, I used a standardized version of Bengali prose, generally used for modern non-fiction. Again, when Janki Nayar used the term precariat in her preface of the original English book, then I was searching for an appropriate Bengali terminology for the word, but I completely failed. So when I was in a zone where as a translator I have to devise a new word, actually precariat is made of two words, precarious and proletariat. And in India, precariat labor is a glaring reality. But there is no common word in Bengali which could be used as a substitution. So for a single English word, I used a combination of four Bengali words. And that is precisely the point that Shastri and Bosu discussed in their respective essays to elaborate on the problems of translating technical global terminologies in a meaningful vernacular which the reader could easily understand. Now, understanding is a complex set of process, but the reader should derive a closest possible meaning of the original text from the translation. Because only through translation that monolingual reader could have access to that resource. And we are all well aware that our access to some resources is the only way of empowering ourselves. And only then a translation holds its value. And in a growingly monolingual society like ours, translations are the only tool through which people could communicate with each other and interpret the world. So a translator's approach has to be commonsensical, and he or she must have conceptual clarity as well as in-depth knowledge on the subject matter of the text, so that the translation could claim a certain degree of usefulness and authenticity. I appreciate your patience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anirban. Thank you very much. I now invite our third speaker, Sachin Ketkar, to make his presentation. Over to you, Sachin.
Yeah, good afternoon, all. So, at the outset, I want to thank the organizers of this international conference, Professor Kunal Chattopadhyay, for inviting me for sharing my views about this very important, probably the most important question for us as Indians today regarding the question of translation and ethics. I would also like to, at the outset, express my gratitude to CLAI and Jadavpur University. My own association with Professor Chandra Mohan is not very, was not, I did not have a great interaction with him. I was not fortunate enough to interact with him. However, I have met him sometimes in some of the seminars, and he came across as extremely warm and encouraging person. And it was always heartening to see him in the seminars, especially science academic seminars. And I was very happy to interact with him. And Professor Ipshita Chanda has talked about his institutional contribution, again, something that I'm not familiar with. So what I intend to do today is not talk so much about more theoretical and more institutional questions, but I want to touch upon them indirectly through account of my own life as a translator in a nutshell. And there is a risk of, as if I'm trying to show off or boast, but I'm putting this across only as a kind of illustrative case of the questions of ethics and the conundrums of monolingualism and multilingualism that we have to face as Indians. So in this short presentation that I intend to do, I will just touch upon some of the key issues through my own personal journey. So I would like to share my screen, and hopefully what I share would also resonate with many of the learned speakers and also very learned friends who are participating and listening to this very interesting session. So I want to begin by speaking about my own experiences as translator and my experiences which involve ethical issues that I faced during my journey. So uh, yeah, so I hope my screen is visible to the participants. So I'm going to talk about translation and ethics of additive bilingualism. And as we have been discussing multilingualism, and Professor Chanda has talked about translation as a way of life, and also the impossibility of monolingualism in India. I just want to point out that multilingualism as a way of life is a banal fact on Indian subcontinent, but that doesn't mean that I think of Western societies and cultures as inherently monolingual, because though the orientations of many of the Western cultures is monolingual, I always feel that there is a kind of multilingual or bilingual context to, and as well as many languages that coexist even in the West, something that needs to be sufficiently highlighted. But what I'm going to focus upon is the question of my own journey as a translator and how I had to face these questions. So uh, what I intend to do in this presentation is that I'm going to give a very brief overview of my life as a creative writer, not so much, but as more as translator and academician, not with the intention of self-promotion, but more as an illustrative case. And I'm sure some of what I say will resonate with many scholars who are listening to this presentation. And in this process, I also intend to examine the underlying historical, ethical, cultural context of my work and my own personal location in terms of post-colonial and post-global predicament produced by what a very renowned sociolinguist and psychologist Wallace E. Lambert has termed as subtractive bilingualism, and how I use literary translation as a genre of creative writing as a mode of additive bilingualism in order to creatively negotiate with the impoverishing and probably devastating impact of subtractive bilingualism in our country and the related questions of cultural identity. I will also touch upon the pervasive impact of subtractive bilingualism on institutional and research contexts of English studies and translation studies in India, and how in my own very small, modest way, I'm trying to negotiate and to some extent overcome this devastating impact as an academician. So as a creative writer, translator and academician based in Gujarat, I have been writing poetry and criticism mostly in Marathi and English, while I have been translating largely from Gujarati and Marathi into English. So as a Marathi speaking uh, person who is born and brought up in Gujarat and who has studied English as a medium of instruction and who has also studied English literature and he's also in the business of teaching it, I've always felt that I'm always a translator. And this connects to what Professor Ipshita was saying about translation as a way of life. My parents are from Maharashtra and they moved to a small coastal town in Gujarat called Valsad in 1960. And I was born and brought up in Gujarat. Most of the education has been through English as a medium of instruction in this small town. I have been living on the boundaries of geographical, social, cultural spaces in Gujarat, Maharashtra, and probably India as well. Though often thought to be similar, Gujarati and Marathi societies are exceptionally divergent and different historically not just in terms of language and geography, but also in terms of class, caste, gender equations and dynamics. You just have to look at how politics works into adjacent states of Gujarat and Maharashtra. The language I spoke at home was Marathi, and it was for most part Gujarati elsewhere. Or rather, it was Mumbai Pune variety of Marathi, the so-called standard Marathi. And it was the South Gujarat variety of Gujarati, the Surti dialect, that I was exposed to most of my life. And the English that I picked up was a kind of English that you picked up in a small town English medium school, where there would be more Gujarati than English in the school. So I have always felt that I'm not completely a part of Marathi society, geographically as well as culturally. And I was never part of dominant Gujarati culture, as geographically Valsad, where I was born and brought up and studied, is on the boundary of Gujarat and Maharashtra. Culturally, southern Gujarat and Surti dialects are marginal to more dominant cultures from Saurashtra and central Gujarat. And this kind of border, being on border, I felt that translation is something that is as inevitable as breathing, to paraphrase maybe Eliot in a very different context. So in this context, some of the thinking that resonated with me and gave me insight was provided by sociolinguists like Wallace E. Lambert, who makes a distinction between the additive bilingualism, that is a kind of bilingualism in a language learning, language situation, where the first language continues to be developed and the first culture continues to be valued, while the second language is added and acquired. And subtractive bilingualism is that in which the second language is added at the expense of the first language and culture, and it diminishes as a consequence. So in many ways, my immersion in Gujarati language and literature had created a kind of bilingual, subtractive bilingual situation for me, with reference to my first language, Marathi, and was further aggravated by my education in English. Subtractive bilingual situation is a kind of asymmetrical bilingual situation where the acquisition of an elite and powerful language like English results in depletion and deprivation of linguistic, cultural, and creative resources in language in which one is born and brought up. And one has only to think about how a bilingual situation of English Japanese or English German or English Chinese is a very different bilingual situation compared to English and our own first languages. Because very often acquisition of English in Chinese or Japanese or a German situation won't result in depletion of your primary language resources and cultures. So it's hardly subtractive. However, because of the post-colonial and post-global processes of modernization, something that Anirban was referring to, it promotes and at times even fetishizes subtractive bilingualism. And this is one ethical issue that I just want to point out, that very often we as Indian tends to look down upon Indian languages. And refreshingly, I've always found Bengali culture and Bengali society very, very inspiring in terms of that, because I find such a substantial amount of research happening in comparative and English studies, which engages with Bangla literature and culture, something that I think others as Indians should also follow, in my own view. This subtractive bilingualism comes with an exorbitant cost, and that often results not just in various forms of alienation and anomie, but also leads to an impoverished, dangerous, and distorted understanding of Indian past and present, something I think has something to do with contemporary crisis of Indian society and culture, where a kind of distorted, caricatured picture of Indian past is presented by a certain very vicious kind of political thought that seems to circulate in many places. In my life as a creative writer who writes in Marathi and English and lives in Gujarat, translation becomes a primary creative process of negotiating this post-colonial and post-global cultural predicament. Uh, the intricate questions of cultural identity, tradition, modernity, and relevance stared at me at every step I took as a creative writer, writing in Marathi, living in Gujarat, and educated in English and teaching in English. So the question of who I was, what was the tradition for me, or what is the meaning of modernity, or what is relevant to me as a person, for me had to be through translation. So translation, as even Anirban rightly pointed out, is a constitutive feature of Indian modernity. That's something that we need to emphasize when we think of our modernities. I discovered that translation is a way of making intimate ties across languages, cultures, even historical periods, and across regions. It is one of the strategies of relocating oneself in the complex cultural and linguistic topography of Indian society, which is inherently multilingual. So literary translation then is a genre of creative writing for me, and I don't make a distinction in the sense of looking at original creative writing as being superior to my translational activities. They both are the modes which are for me equal. And probably literary translation even becomes more exciting than creative writing very often because of the kind of uh, encounters with the otherness that was being mentioned by Ipshita and Anirban both. So literary translation for me has become a kind of tool to creatively grapple and negotiate with these complex questions. Uh, so I will just kind of share what my journey in a nutshell. And I started writing poetry at the age of 13 and 14 in English when I fell in love with the English poetry that I studied in school. It was Blake and the Romantics to start with. It was then Lewis Carroll, Jerome Eliot, and Wallace Stevens from my 11th and 12th standard English textbooks that actually seduced me into poetry and creative writing. And when I was doing my bachelor's from Valsad, I remember translating Salilakis from Macbeth and some lines from Sri Aurobindo's Savitri, which had a fascination for me at the period, into Hindi, which was the only other Indian language I know apart from English in those days. So then when I came for a master's, I showed some of these translations to Professor Ganesh Devi, who was, apart from many other things, a noted Aurobindonian scholar when I came to Baroda for my master's in 93-95. He suggested to me to try my hands at writing in Marathi. I had never studied Marathi language or literature formally. This means my competence in this language was minimal. My spelling and grammar was atrocious, and probably it is tolerable, but still not as good as, say, for example, other languages. So one of other things that we need to speak about when we are in a trilingual, bilingual, multilingual space, that our abilities in each language are not at par with each other. There is a difference and a kind of unevenness in our competencies in all languages that we know as Indians. So our multilingualism is not a kind of flat thing, but a kind of uneven multilingualism that we inhabit. However, I discovered that Marathi was the language best suited for my creative expression, though it was not language of my formal education. And I could do a lot of things with Marathi which I could not with English. And I have been writing in both Marathi and English since then. So multilingualism for me is primarily not an ethical position, but more of a banal fact of everyday life, a way of life, as have been mentioned. After my master's, when I was considering various areas for specialization for PhD program, I started researching translation and started out by trying my hands at translating a great 17th century Gujarati poet, Akho. He is very famous for what is known as chappa. So these are the terse, highly compact, satirical philosophical stanzas, and I found that I could not do justice to their wit, wordplay, and brevity, and also pungent sarcasm that Akho brought about. Thus, I felt that the translation would lose much of their punch and effectiveness in English. I have heard that now Akho is translated by Giu Patel and one other person. So it's people who are interested can read up. My choice later on for selecting Narsi Mehta's poems for translation, again after suggestion by Professor G. N. Devi, for doctoral research also came from my particular situation. As I used to commute from Valsad, where I used to live, and go to a place called Navsari, which is around 30-40 kilometers away, where I worked, I frequently heard the exquisite songs of Narsi Mehta being sung by my fellow commuters. Narsi Mehta, incidentally, is also extremely popular and a living poet of Gujarat, very much like Bhakti poets are in most of the parts of India, even today. So many of the garbas and ras are composed by Narsi Mehta, and thus it's part of living culture. So translation studies, when I took up Narsi Mehta for translation in late 90s something, was an acceptable area in the English studies. And in these parts of the world, in the Western region, in mid-90s, though some significant work had been done in comparative literature, the very idea that you can translate a Gujarati poet into English for your PhD was not a very acceptable idea. So during, in spite of the fact that this English studies as a discipline was just coming out of the very well-known debate, so-called crisis in English studies in India, and the Department of English at the MS University, where I was doing my master's, had included a paper titled Politics and Ideology of Teaching English in India at master's level. So in spite of this apparent opening up of English studies to critical theory and culture studies, my research would have hardly been seen as acceptable during the mid-90s and in the most departments of English. And I'm not thinking about comparative literature departments, but English studies department per se, which in which I'm housed even today, where I'm speaking from. However, at the Department of English at South Gujarat University, Surat, where there is also a comparative literature department, I enrolled for my research under Professor Daksha Vamdat in the Department of English for my research. Narsi also remains a living presence in form of prabhatiyas or devotional folk songs sung in the morning in Gujarat and in garbas performed during Navratri. And I was amazed to know how living a poet who lived more than 500 years ago can be. And translating Narsi was an extraordinary life-altering kind of experience for me. I tried to capture something of his delicately erotic nature of his poetry, his mysticism and philosophical quality in English. And very often when the name Narsi Mehta comes up, people think that he is a kind of Gandhian poet. But he is more in the lines of Jaydev and celebration of eroticism, Shrungar is also as much part of his oeuvre as Vedantic or can you come after half an hour? Yeah, I have a lecture. So his oeuvre, which consists of the Vedantic thought and bhakti poetry as well, has substantial amount of very explicit kind of eroticism that you find in Jaydev's Geet Govind. So the compositions in the original language were clearly meant to be sung and performed in front of live audience, unlike the English translation. And this involved a shift from oral text to written text, from face-to-face performance to the experience of reading. It was also a shift from a different language and culture to a different language and cultural frames that interpreted. It was a conversion from one types of poetics into altogether different one. So the difficulties in translation could not be dealt with only in terms of formal linguistics, but in terms of culture, history, politics, metaphysics, and so on. So translation became an artistic tool for me to engage with the question of my own cultural identity. because that's where I was located in Gujarat, and Narsingh Mehta was a living presence in Gujarat. So as a Marathi creative writer who is writing in English as well, the translation became a tool to engage with my cultural context, which was both Marathi and Gujarati and English. So I also reflected upon and theorized translation very often from my own location as a bilingual Indian creative writer living on the margins of two cultures. So after my doctoral project towards the turn of the century, I translated extensively from contemporary Gujarati and Marathi fiction and poetry. For instance, from Gujarati, I have translated renowned contemporary poets like Manilal Desai, Rauji Patel, Ghulam Muhammad Sheikh, Shitancho Yashish Chandra, Chinu Modi, Dilip Javeri, Rajendra Patel, Jaydev Shukla, Mangal Rathod, Rajesh Pandya, Sahil Parmar, Ajay Saravaiya, and Piyush Thakkar. I have also translated contemporary fiction of leading Gujarati writers like Jayant Khatri, Bhupen Khakkar, Nazir Mansuri, and Mona Patrawala. And apart from translating their works, I have also written academic articles on these writers. Later on, I translated more than 30 contemporary Marathi poets like Malika Amar Sheikh, Arun Kale, Hemant Divte, Mangesh Narayan Rao Kale, Manya Joshi, Salil Wagh, and Kavita Mahajan for my anthology titled Live Update, an anthology of recent Marathi poetry that appeared in 2005. So translation allowed me to engage creativity with culture I was born and brought up in. It also allowed me to explore not just Gujarati literature, but also its fascinating culture, history, language, a language that I love as much as I love Marathi or English. So translating many marginal Gujarati writers gave me an access to other Gujarats, which are outside of the mainstream representation of Gujaratis, and other Maharashtras. The Gujarats and the Maharashtras are marginal communities and dialects of also of marginal sexualities and geographies. The Gujarats and Maharashtra, which did not fit into the stereotype of Gujarati and Marathi culture, promoted by others and very often by Gujaratis and Marathis themselves. So translation allowed me to discover things which lie beyond the pale of stereotypical representation of these cultures by people themselves as well as by others. This is my experience that I also discovered in the process that the editors of prestigious language publications in which I attempted to publish my translation recklessly impose stylistic modifications on the translations to make the regional languages of India so as to make them more suitable for their readers. Interestingly, these editors have hardly any knowledge of source languages, cultural histories, or the processes of translation, or even the aesthetics of literary genres. They feel that, however, they are making translations more readable. However, what one means by readable or natural is question not many of these editors would pursue. So linguistically, whether there is such a thing as a single natural English register, even when English is the first language, is a question that I would like to ask before whether there is a single universal natural English register in the world exists. So today, when we are talking of Englishes rather than a single English, asking for conforming to some one subjective perception of natural English resembles a kind of neo-colonial mindset for me. And this is one of the ethical, political, problematic issue that I faced while negotiating these multiple languages through translation and publishing them. So in spite of growing awareness of historical pluricentrality of Englishes in the theories of world Englishes developed by Braj Kachru and others, the predominant canonical normativity of the first circle, the Anglo-American Anglophone idiom and literary poetics, hold a hegemonic force for many editors of Indian literature in English translation, who either tend to flatten out cultural richness and diversity of the archive under the argument of readability, or retain some unessential exotic elements added as artificial local color, which was trendy, thanks to the phrase of technification of English given by Rushdie at that time. These editors of leading publication houses are actually gatekeepers, to use William Marling's term, for Indian literature as world literature in English translation today, and who are themselves very often the victims of subtractive bilingualism. That is, their knowledge of vernacular literary and cultural traditions is minimal. So is their awareness of literary traditions in international context. So subtractive bilingualism has a kind of pervasive impact, not just on a person, but also institutions which are publishing Indian literature in English translation. It's obviously pervasive in academics. So while I admit that editors have the right to proofread the text for grammatical errors, a question which is equally vexed, or point out, not change, but suggest changes, the existence of cliches and idiomatic oddities, I believe that changing of imagery, syntax, lexis, paragraph sequences, descriptive passages without any knowledge of the source text, cultural histories to which it belongs, seem to perpetuate a certain kind of mindset. And this is the ethical issue that also I'm trying to flag. Though Indian English appears as an intermediary vernacular in the asymmetrical circles of world English, and so I see English as a kind of intermediary vernacular produced by the famous Macaulay's or infamous Macaulay's project of world English. The canonicity is still determined by Anglophone first circle. To use Braj Kachu's model, I believe English is very much an Indian language. But Indians who speak English have to learn how to treat the other Indian languages as equals. And I'm going to end with a kind of funny incident that I heard, that there are many students or many contemporaries who start speaking English in an American accent without having set their foot outside India. And this is a kind of strange internal cultural diaspora brought about by globalization. And this is my theorization of Indian literature in English translation based on my own experiences. We can conceptualize Indian literature in English translation as belonging to this global world Englishes literary polysystem, where the Anglophone Englishes of the first circle are central, and literatures like Gujarati or Marathi literatures in translation are still peripheral and marginal, in spite of an occasional booker that seems to accidentally come across Indian writing in English translation because of the fact that it's published abroad. So this is the last point. Consequently, not only as a translator, but also as an academic, I attempt to promote Gujarati and Marathi literatures in undergrad syllabus, doctoral research projects that I supervise, and workshops and seminars I organize in order to redress this inequality and asymmetry in my own small way. And life as a creative writer and translator is an attempt to overcome this historical damage done by subtractive bilingualism at several levels. For instance, some of my research scholars work on translation and formation of popular Gujarati fiction, translation and world literature in local Gujarati periodicals and anthologies, post-colonial approaches to Maithili literature and English translation, translation and memory in Gujarati Bhakti poetry in translation, and so on and so forth. So in my research, I often tried to argue that the pedagogical institution in India often practice subtractive bilingualism culturally. The bilingualism of Anglo-Bhasha creative writers like Kolkata or Chitre or Vilas Sarang or Kiran Nagarkar, to name a few, is actually a kind of additive bilingualism. In spite of the fact that they are accused of playing it to gallery or betraying one's cultures by nativist and nationalist. Because their work in English and their translation expands the cultural and artistic repertoires of literary traditions and expands the horizons of both of them, contributing to both these cultures simultaneously. Nevertheless, subtractive bilingualism shapes the politics of Indian literature in English and in English translation. So these are some of my experiences and my observations and findings that I wanted to share in this very interesting panel on monolingualism. And we can only mention monolingualism, but we cannot be monolingual, and the ethics of translation. So these are some of my views, and I will be very happy to respond to queries and questions if anyone has that. So thank you very much again for having me here.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sachin.
Thank
Now
you.
the floor is open for discussion. We have about 10 minutes time. If there are any questions for any of the speakers or any observation, any discussion. Yes, Akashnil.
May I ask? Uh, I have a couple of questions, but I know this is just 10 minutes, and specifically for IC and Dr. Ketkar. General questions, but specifically to IC. First is, what was Manu Babu's method of comparative literature of translation? If you could just explicate a bit for us. I mean, readers of Bangla have a particular idea of what Manu Babu meant, but for us who are trying to go back to Bangla, away from the Anglophone, if you could just tell us a bit about that. That's the first. And second is, when anybody is translating, I'm talking about the translator's activity more than action. I am asking about the ethics of the self which is translating. What happens in my case, the little that I have been trying to translate, one becomes very selfish. I want to know, I want to translate, I want to understand, and I want to share. How does one get out of this process of self? Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah. So to your first question, the short answer in 10 minutes, because I want to ask 3 questions to Sachin. So I want to make space for myself. And this is for everybody. I mean, of course, if you do not read Bangla, I'm sorry, but the point is that, well, I mean, translating Manu Babu's work into English is very ironical, and so possibly I think we should do it. That irony is the basis of Manu Babu's vision, which is what I call comparative. So without, I mean, to cut a long story short in 2 sentences, 1, please read the introductions which are written in Bangla. Then please look at what has been selected, and then please go back and read the context in which those poems were written. I'm talking about pedagogy here. I'm not talking about the common reader. You are a translator because you are a literary scholar. Whether you choose to think like a common reader while you are translating is your ethical choice. And that will bring me to the second thing, that you need to, that is why I was talking about irony. You need to, sorry, this sounds like an axiom. That's the last thing I want, because it's completely opposite to something called a method. And I'm trying to advocate, well, conscious practice. So you need conscious practice. Just as you need to locate the poet, etc., you need to locate yourself in relation to the poet. And I think all that Sachin said is an object lesson. He taught us in class how this is to be done on both sides. And so I want to just tell Sachin that I want you, I mean, I'm saying want because of the imposition of theory. Bilingualism or monolingualism, subtractive or additive, are built on a monolingual model of thinking. Multilingualism is banal when we judge it from a monolingual model of thinking. So we are still looking at a counter narrative. I would suggest to you especially that we need a different model of thinking, neither monolingual nor bilingual. My personal idea is plural, and everything that you said supports that. I mean, I can actually rewrite your entire presentation from your point of view using plural, and from my point of view using plural as well, because we seem to have traversed, similar trajectories. And with just this little difference, you were talking about, and I'm so glad that both you and Anirban talked about specific things, because that is the only way in which one can actually convey something. The difficulty that we have now is a difficulty of vocabulary. So these specific things we are still talking about in language that does not fit the experience. So to Akashnil, without, just going further, I think I would need to say that if you think you want to know from a literary text, then the only thing you will know from a literary text is yourself. So you need to distance yourself from yourself before you start knowing anything about yourself. You're not knowing about the other from the translation. A translation is a transparent activity. That is why it is ethical. It is a transparent engagement with many others, an other world, and that is not made up of one other. So the first thing, and that is what I was saying in the beginning, that we need to learn how to listen, which means we need to learn how to be quiet first and sensitive. And all of this has been demonstrated by Sachin in this entire, whatever he has shared with us.
Yeah. So I would just want to come to the second question that about self, and probably related to Professor Ipshita's remark. You cannot think of self as ever existing in isolation, and translation is built on the awareness that there is no such thing as self existing in isolation. Means otherwise, why would you translate? So even if it is my understanding, my translation, it's always the engagement with the other. So my existence depends on the other, and that is what translation acutely makes one aware of in some way. So it's not about self alone. The self cannot exist in isolation, and translation, there has to be something that has to be translated. So, or someone. That's my response to the second question. And the remark with Professor Chandra made was very interesting, that we are still thinking from a monolingual, it's a counter discourse to the monolingualism. Then plural is also a kind of counter discourse to the singular. So it's a very difficult thing to come out of the binary. And probably it's in the ancient philosophy that we think of plural and singular coexisting as Advaita, as one existing as many. And Narsimha Mehta talks about Akhila Brahmandama Ekatu Shri Hari Jujve Rupe Ananta Base. You are alone in this world, but you still appear in so many guises. So one appears as many and many appears as one. We cannot get rid of these binaries at all, even if we want to.
Sir, I don't agree at all. Though I agree with everything you said, the last thing I don't agree with. Because then I mean, and it's very interesting that we are talking about, both Narsimha Mehta and Anekantvad, which is, its heritage is from the discourses of Mahavira. So each of these singles exist, and they have to interact in order to find the one. They cannot do it, as you said earlier, so it's not a binary we are talking about. We are talking about singularity. I agree with you completely, but conditioned singularity. I am.
Again, Narsimha Mehta speaks about how, again, question that came up about self. He tells God that you exist because I exist.
Yeah, totally.
Right. So he's that kind of statement that he's making for me is very astonishing. That the other exists because you exist, and the divine exists because we exist. So I think this the whole dialogue between self and other cannot be reduced to any one of these.
No, I agree with you. I'm just saying that the conceptualization of the self is in relation to the other, which is what you said also.
Yes.
However, I mean, when we are talking about Narsi Mehta, and I'm so glad that you, I mean, thank you very much. The whole, I mean, the language there is of devotion. I would like to think that the language of Mahavira is that of a spirituality. The achievement is different in both cases. So, I mean, we require for spirituality a consciousness that has to be spiritual. We also require in devotion a consciousness, but the relation that we have in devotion is distinct from the relation that we have to truth, God. I mean, if I'm spiritual, I might call it truth, but if I'm devoted, I will call it God. Whether it is, you know, Ghat Ghat Mein Ram Base after all. So the name is important. And that kind of brings up a completely different world because of translating, you know, literature and history, which Anirban was talking about. He said that one particular word has to have a single sign. That is something which is prevalent in an oral culture. Anirban, did I miss
Yes.
quote you?
Yeah, actually, Ramendra Sundar
Right,
Trivedi
right.
suggested that.
Yeah. So, I mean, in a culture of devotion and in a culture of spirituality, we have had written work. But in the culture of devotion, this orality is more, you know, I mean, Tulsi is supposed to have said that everybody is dancing around about how difficult it is to think about the Nirgun. But think about the Sagun. You cannot think about any other form except the one in which you worship. That is the essence of, you know. So I agree that we cannot put it into binaries. And therefore I say, because we need both, right? So we have to reimagine the relation. That's all. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Ipshita. Thank you, Sachin. I think we don't have any further time left and we have to move on. So this brings us to the end of the first plenary session of this conference. Thanks to everybody. We are signing off. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.